Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. Steve Meyer here, and you have either deliberately or stumbled upon part 2 of my YouTube series based on an essay I just recently put together called Heavy Music Visionaries, Inventors, Innovators, and Followers. Right? And this is a 7-part series where I highlight many of the artists who have pushed heavy music forward. And this is really important because these are the folks that keep the music alive for us, keep it changing, keep it vital, keep it relevant, right? So I think this is really important stuff. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to frame this series and a lot of these discussions in using the inventors, innovators format. Right? And I think by doing that, there's a lot of issues surrounding hard rock and heavy metal that can be clarified. Okay, so that's why I'm doing it. Here in part 2, we're going to look specifically at the idea of hard rock being an innovation and heavy metal, in contrast, being a true invention. Now, as I talked about in part 1 that sort of set this up, in general, an invention is something that's been developed that didn't exist before. Something that's been created, but we didn't have it before. Whereas an innovation is an improvement or a significant alteration to something that did exist before, right? Now, usually when we talk about inventions and innovations, we usually put it in the context of, consumer products, consumer services, producer products, could be ideas too. Doesn't get talked about as much in music, and from what I can tell, I don't think it's ever been really talked about with respect to heavy music, hard rock, and heavy metal. And that's sort of what I'm going to do in this part 2. So let's dive in a little bit here. Share the screen. So as always, if you want to read the entire paper without worrying about the YouTube presentations, the links are below. So check that out if you want. Otherwise, if you follow along with me, that's cool too. So hard rock as an innovation, heavy metal as an invention. All right. So actually, before I even do that, I'm gonna pull a bit of a mulligan here. I prepared a little framework for us. And so what I'm arguing is so the way I've coded this, anything that's in a red box, I'm calling an invention, and anything that's in a green box, I'm calling an innovation. Okay, again, the invention is that it's significantly different enough that we're going to call it something truly new, whereas an innovation might be a significant development, but it's really a variation on what came before. Okay, so if we kind of look at hard rock and heavy metal, sort of at the end here where we're going to get, just a quick overview. Well, if we look at the lineage of these types of music, it can go back to at least the blues and rhythm and blues, which has been around for decades, perhaps centuries now at this point. Decades for sure, right? So blues and especially rhythm and blues, an invention. There wasn't really anything quite like it before, so we'll call it an invention. Lots of people do, by the way. And then rock and roll definitely came out of rhythm and blues, but rock and roll was different enough that, again, most people will say that rock and roll was a new thing, an invention. From rock and roll, eventually we get rock. Or some people will put the two together completely, but I would say there is a difference between rock and roll and rock, but not enough of a difference that we could call rock music a true invention. It's an innovation on what came before. Right? And then from rock, we get a couple things, many things, but a couple things that we'll talk about in the context of this discussion. Hard rock came out of rock. It's a variation on the rock, on the rock and roll blueprint, which was rock was an innovation on rock and roll, and I would argue hard rock is an innovation on rock. Again, hard rock not different enough from what came before, right, to call it an invention, but certainly different enough that we certainly should call it an innovation, right? Prog rock or progressive rock is the one exception. Of all the different rock types, and there's lots of them, I suppose, right? Prog rock to me is the one type of rock that I think is different enough from, say, rock and roll and rhythm and blues that it should be called a new invention, right? And indeed, I would say the same thing about heavy metal. Heavy metal, sure, I think you can say was to a large degree an outgrowth of hard rock, but it's very distinct from hard rock in ways that I'm going to describe in this episode in just a couple minutes. I think it's certainly different enough that we should consider it a new thing, a new invention. Okay, so that's kind of the framework. Let me sort of elaborate on this a little bit going forward. Okay, back to the essay. So hard rock is an outgrowth of rock and roll. Okay, so most will cite the grandfathers of rock and roll as people like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino, Carl Perkins, Bo Diddley, of course Elvis, right? And there would be others I'm sure people would list from the 1950s. So that's sort of where the invention of rock and roll sort of begins for most people. And again, as my flowchart was showing, these personalities were themselves outgrowths of previous musical forms. Primarily the blues, but probably most directly would be rhythm and blues, right? Where rock and roll is the outgrowth from. Yet this simple, talking about rock and roll, this simple, catchy, energetic form of popular music is typically viewed as distinct enough to form a new invention, right? So rock and roll was distinct enough from rhythm and blues that rock and roll was a new thing. Really, there was nothing like it before, right? So we call rock and roll an invention, right? And then going forward from the 50s, rock and roll, or perhaps more simply rock, right? For some people, it's one and the same. For others, rock would be an innovation on rock and roll. That's kind of how I see it. But anyway, rock and roll groups in the 1960s, some of the biggies, there were lots of them, but some of the biggies you'll know, of course, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Kinks, the Beatles, of course, right? Now, these bands certainly added their innovative stamp. I'm not for a second saying, like, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying these bands weren't important. They were wildly important, right? They added their innovative stamp big time on music, right? But they all kept the rock and roll tradition more or less intact, right? So I would argue the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, the Beatles, they weren't really inventors. They were incredibly important innovators. That's how I would see it anyway, right? Some might differ with that. And again, it's not meant as a knock. I know how important the Beatles are to a lot of people. But the Beatles, to me, were incredibly vital, important innovators. And they took a known art form and took it to really different areas for sure, but they didn't really invent that much new, is sort of what I'm saying. They improved or developed something that was already in existence. Okay, so you may or may not agree with that. In the early 70s then, moving forward, a much more aggressive form of rock and roll, commonly labeled hard rock, emerged that featured, for sure there was distinctiveness here, new levels of volume, new levels of speed, new levels of distortion, a real big rebellious attitude, right? However, much of the groove and upbeat atmosphere of hard rock, right, was very similar to what their 60s parents were doing and their 50s grandparents. So 60s parents like the Stones and 50s grandparents like Little Richard and Chuck Berry, right? They maintained that, okay, that upbeat sort of atmosphere, that upbeat groove atmosphere. Now, by upbeat, let me clarify that a little bit. I'm especially referring to the 4/4 danceable, sort of groovable, if you like, time, all right? Or at least rhythmically movement-inducing meter of music. The lyrical content wasn't always up for hard rock, right? Lots of times it was, like often, you know, it's the party atmosphere and all that sort of thing, you know, and carefree rebelliousness and all that, right? But then sometimes the lyrics were more varied and the dark times could be emphasized as well. Hard rock was never as dark as metal, as we're going to see, but yeah, there are some things that about hard rock were kind of dark too, right? Okay, so appropriate examples of well-known hard rock artists that sort of emerged in the 70s, had their origins in the 70s. Again, you'll know most of these, right? But all of these artists clearly upheld the original rock and roll vibe, right? Yeah, they were hard rock. Yeah, they were pretty aggressive and pretty loud and distorted, but they were basically rock. They came out of the rock and roll tradition, and that was evident. So Aerosmith, Kiss, Cheap Trick, Ted Nugent, Triumph, Van Halen, Bachman Turner Overdrive, AC/DC, Guns N' Roses. Well, Guns N' Roses was a little bit later. Motorhead, and at least part of the time, Led Zeppelin, Queen, Alice Cooper, Thin Lizzy, UFO, and Deep Purple. These latter bands, yes, they were more diverse. They didn't just do hard rock all the time. They were doing other things. But really their core would be hard rock and going back to the rock and roll tradition, right? Okay. This might also be a little controversial, but I would also add that the early punk rockers of the mid to late 70s, I would add all of these bands to the list of rock and roll outgrowths as well. I don't think punk was a new music. I think it was an incredibly important innovation, but I don't think it was an invention. I think punk was indeed yet another outgrowth of rock and roll. Right? If one ignores the new clothing fashions and haircuts of the Ramones, the Damned, the Clash, and even the Pistols, right? They were doing stuff that was not that far removed from what their hard rock contemporaries were doing, you know? Less the obligatory guitar solo. So sure, punk bands didn't get all excited over the guitar solos, whereas hard rock bands had all kinds of guitar solos. Yes, they look different. Yes, all that stuff. I know there's a lot of punk rockers out there that would hate the idea of me putting the Clash in with Aerosmith or something. I'm not necessarily putting them in the same category. They are distinct. Hard rock and punk are distinct. My point is they both have similar lineage. They both came out of rock and roll, basically. Right? So all the punkers, yes, they had distinctiveness, but they certainly tipped their collective hats to the rock and rollers of the late 50s and early 60s. And most of them would say as such, right? So I'm not really saying anything that's not already common knowledge. And even some of the art rockers who were like, you know, the deep thinking rock and rollers, or the ones that were, you know, maybe the most diverse in a lot of ways. So I'm thinking people like Lou Reed and Iggy Pop and David Bowie, the Doors, these types of bands. Yeah, they displayed a wide array of influences, no question. And at times when they wanted to, they could rock with the best of them. They could be as hard rocking as Kiss and Alice Cooper if they wanted to, right? But my point is, their core sounds never deviated substantially from the rock and roll tradition, right? So again, Lou Reed, Iggy Pop, David Bowie, the Doors, incredibly important, right? Art rockers. They pushed the sophistication of rock forward, you know, in a lot of ways, right? Yes, Iggy did, by the way. But were they truly inventors? I don't think so. I think they were truly important innovators, but I don't think they invented anything new. Right? Certainly David Bowie didn't, right? So, but I don't think any of them did. So hard rock, punk rock, art rock, alternative rock, all those rocks, right? I think they all, as innovative as they were and as incredibly important and great as they weren't inventors, right? They were innovators, okay? They were developing what came before. One really important big exception to this. There's one type of rock, I think, that I think you have to call an invention. That it's too different, too distinct to be just an innovation, right? And that's progressive or prog rock, which actually is usually categorized under the rock umbrella, if not even hard rock sometimes. But it doesn't display a clear lineage to rock and roll, like unlike hard rock and punk rock and art rock, etc., right? Indeed, the distinctiveness of prog makes it more aptly labeled an invention, and I truly believe that. I'm going to say a whole lot more about prog rock because I think in a lot of ways prog is one of the most important forms of music in heavy music in general that really pushes things forward. So a lot more about prog in part 6 of this series, so down the road a little bit. But the distinctiveness of prog makes it an invention, I would say, rather than an innovation, which I think does apply to pretty much any other rock form. Okay, so that's how I would see it. So yes, some of these prog rockers of the 60s and 70s had their rock and roll moments. Yes, they did. But most of what they did was all new territory. So I'm thinking about bands like Jethro Tull, Yes, King Crimson, one of the most innovative bands ever, Gentle Giant, like all of these bands. I guess I could say the same thing for all of them, so I won't do that because they're all just out there innovative like crazy, or they were. Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Vandergraaf Generator, Pink Floyd, Eloy, Rush, you know, possibly the prog metal pioneers, and many other like-minded players that emerged out of the late 60s and 70s were forging something completely new. The complexity of the song structures alone separated prog from rock, right? Like, again, rock and hard rock, punk rock, most of those songs were pretty simple. And that's not a knock. That was their appeal. Prog rock was anything but simple. You might hate prog rock, and if you're a punk rocker, you probably do. But you have to agree, the complexity of the songs were immense. And that's separate. Maybe it's that complexity that separates prog from other forms of rock as much as anything, right? But there's other things. The fact that prog rockers or prog prog rock, I'll just say in general. The fact that many of these artists composed and performed at a level of musicianship in league with elite jazz and classical players and took influences from virtually any musical genre made prog rock a virtual island within the musical spectrum, right? Again, more about this in other parts of the series. Okay, so that's hard rock in general. I mean, again, in terms of heavy music, hard rock, an innovation. Prog rock, the exception in terms of rock and invention. And another invention to me was heavy metal. Heavy metal became new terrain. Okay. So some, maybe many, might view heavy metal as merely an extension of rock, particularly hard rock. And yeah, I think there's evidence that that's true. But if that's the only way you view metal, I think you miss the mark, right? I think that completely misses the mark, actually, in a lot of ways. Such statements are usually made by folks who don't understand either art form very well, right? So they don't really understand what hard rock's about, or especially probably don't understand what heavy metal's about. So if they think they're one and the same, they don't really understand the what these art forms really are, right? Or some of the confusion, maybe a lot of it, is that these judgments are based on the bands themselves, and many bands blur the line between hard rock and heavy metal themselves, which again makes it, fair. It's fair how that could be confusing. There are a lot of bands out there, metal or hard rock, that play both or play some sort of hybrid between the two. So that quite rightly will confuse a lot of people, right? Okay, but in actual fact, heavy metal displays little resemblance to what acts like Chuck Berry and later the Rolling Stones, and then even later than that, Aerosmith, and then even later than that, Guns N' Roses were preaching. Metal has almost nothing to do with what these bands were doing. In fact, I would say virtually nothing, right? Heavy metal is either too fast or too slow for folks that want to rock and roll. I mean, that might be the biggest separator right there, right? Now, I'm going to go into more detail about this as the series goes on, of how metal is distinct and how, again, which I think that it just confuses people. But generally speaking, I know that's simple, but it's actually fairly profound. Heavy metal is either too fast or too slow for people that want to just listen to hard rock or rock and roll, basically. Right? That actually rhymes. Isn't that something? All right. Other things. With heavy metal, the songs are typically structured around guitar riffs. The riffs rule in heavy metal. No question about it. Yes, guitar riffs are important in hard rock too, but there's lots of chord structuring going on in hard rock as well. With metal, the riffs are the king, right? The guitar riffs can be very elaborate, incredibly hard to play, or just relentless, right? The guitar solos are always a main feature in metal, and they're absolutely ripping. They're usually completely over the top. Drums are absolutely pounding, and truly disturbed or distorted vocals are nearly constant features, okay? The subject matter of heavy metal is almost always dark, depressing, or psychologically distressing. Way darker than any other form of music, basically, that I know, right? Certainly way darker than hard rock, generally speaking, right? And the reason the subject matter is dark, depressing, or distressing is it's an effort to create an unsettling, violent, or brooding atmosphere in the music, right? Now, sometimes with heavy metal, it can be fantasy-based. Some of these themes are explored, usually in a nightmarish kind of way. It's not usually a happy ending, right? But more often, metal bands write about their realities and dwell on the evils of people and or social conventions. That's sort of the common themes again, or threads that sort of put metal together. Heavy metal is rarely happy, as you might guess by the above description. The only time metal is sort of happy is when they're celebrating metal in sort of a kinship kind of way, and typically it's us against the world sort of thing. Judas Priest does that occasionally. Man of War, pretty famous for that. Here's the thing that I don't think heavy metal gets near enough credit for. Heavy metal is almost always more cerebral than hard rock. And deeper thinking on the part of the listener will yield maximum benefit. The reason a lot of people seem to have this idea that heavy metal is stupid music for stupid people, it's because they don't really know what heavy metal is. They think Motley Crue is heavy metal. Nothing against Motley Crue, they're cool at what they do, but Motley Crue is not deep and cerebral. But Motley Crue isn't heavy metal, right? So a lot of people, again, they don't know what metal is if they think it's very simple, stupid music. It's just the opposite, right? Okay, so It's more cerebral than hard rock, and deeper thinking on the part of the listener will yield maximum benefit. You have to work at heavy metal because it is complex. If you're not going to put the time in with metal, you'll either hate it or you won't understand it. Hard rock, no. Hard rock, in comparison, it's based on feel. You don't have to really think to enjoy most forms of hard rock, right? The exception would be prog rock, okay? But most forms of rock and hard rock, it's instinctual, it's simple, it's catchy, it's based on feel, right? I mean, some forms of hard rock are much deeper than that. I'm not saying they all are, but that's the more typical sort of trend, right? And some of it's a lot more complex, but like I say, that tends to be the prog side of things, which is a different category, and it's an invention in its own right. Okay, so there are really key differences there between hard rock and heavy metal, you know? Okay, in the early 1970s, artists playing anything heavy, so again, say, you know, take Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and others, initially they were reluctant to be associated with the heavy metal tag because of its derogatory connotations. In the 70s, if somebody called you a heavy metal band, that was a put down, right? So because of that, of course, most bands are going to say, well, we don't, you know, they're not going to want to own up to being playing heavy metal because people think that's a bad thing, right? This changes somewhat once the art form becomes more legitimized, you know, several years later. Judas Priest was probably the first band to embrace the heavy metal label, right? But actually, this only mattered to a degree because vast portions of the mainstream and so-called learned critics have always looked down on metal or just never understood it, right? And I think that's the reason. Metal has never really been understood by most people unless you're indeed into it and a fan. And I think that's still pretty true today in a lot of ways. In contrast, though, I would say whether you like hard rock or not, few are going to find it incomprehensible, right? So hard rock, if it's not your cup of tea, that's totally fine, no problem. But you're probably at least going to get what they're doing. You just don't like it. And that's fair, right? Whereas heavy metal, I would argue in a lot of cases, you might not like it, and that's fair too. But in a lot of cases, you don't even understand it. It makes no sense to you, right? So I think that's another big difference between metal and hard rock. There's no question, heavy metal's different, especially in its more extreme forms, which we saw emerge after the 1980s, and we continue to get even more extreme forms of metal. But again, once thrash metal and death metal, doom metal, black metal, when all that emerged, then it got even more difficult to understand for people that weren't into it, right? The speed, the complexity, the sinister vibes, and or just the flat-out weirdness of metal has always been far removed from rock and roll and even most forms of hard rock. Frankly, this is not music for dance parties, okay? I can't say that without laughing, but it isn't. I mean, heavy metal's not for a dance party, right? It's not for mainstream radio broadcasts, right? It's not for background at workplaces. It's not even necessarily for the socially inclined in a lot of cases. If movement is enticed from heavy metal, it manifests in headbanging and mosh pits or something similar to that, which again, to the uninitiated, probably looks violent and kind of scary, right? Playing at breakneck or sloth speeds that logically tie in dark lyrical material not only takes considerable skill to deliver convincingly, but it also time to comprehend, as I was saying. You've got to put the time in to really understand heavy metal. So whether entertaining its followers or annoying and or baffling most others, heavy metal actually has little in common with what came before it. Even hard rock, once one goes beyond mere appearances and physical dress, that probably mixes people up too. Again, not to keep picking on Motley Crue, but in the early days of Crue, they looked really metal with all the long hair and the leather and the crosses and everything else going on, the pentagrams, right? But Motley Crue has never been metal for a day, right? So again, I think these types of things mix people up, right? In short, I believe that heavy metal is plenty distinct enough to be considered an invention. Okay, so where does a lot of the confusion come in? Again, I think it's because people confuse the invention with the players. I think that's the problem here, right? So when we're trying to get at definitions and our search for clarity, I think we need to make that distinction, right? There's a difference between the invention that is heavy metal and those who play it, or there can be, okay? Let me elaborate on this just for a couple minutes. Admittedly, separating heavy metal from hard rock in practice might be difficult for some listeners because many well-known bands do not necessarily stick to one style of playing. Okay, so on one hand, yes, there are bands that are pretty obvious that they're full-on metal. Venom, Slayer, Pantera, Exodus, Creator, Overkill, Children of Bodom, Lamb of God. I mean, with very few exceptions in their discography, these bands pretty much played metal all the time. No confusion there. However, lots of other bands, and I'm going to use the examples of probably the four, and I don't think, not probably, I'd say for sure, the four most well-known so-called metal bands. Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, and Metallica. I think they're the top of the heap in popularity, and you might not like anything these bands do, but you've probably heard of them, okay? For many people, that's the epitome of heavy metal. This is what they think of heavy metal. They think of Sabbath, Priest, Maiden, and Metallica, right? And probably others, but those four for sure, right? Well, here's the kicker. Those four bands weren't metal all the time, right? And again, that's what I think starts to confuse people. A couple of examples might be helpful. Okay, the original Black Sabbath band of the 70s, so Tony Iommi, Ozzy, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, are often credited as inventors of heavy metal, right? So again, the epitome of heavy metal. Hey, Black Sabbath invented heavy metal for Pete's sake, right? I dispute that, actually. See part 3, the next part of this series, for my arguments on that. I'm not knocking Black Sabbath, probably my favorite band, but I think it's way too narrow to say Black Sabbath invented heavy metal, even if that's what a lot of people think. Anyway, but it doesn't erase the fact, there's no question, Sabbath played heavy and had songs that were metal even before the term was broadly used. No question, right? Yet I would argue that roughly half of the albums of Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Technical Ecstasy, and Never Say Die were rock, and not even necessarily hard rock. They weren't metal. There's only parts of those albums that were metal. Let's we'll go to a couple illustrations here, and I'll kind of run through this quickly. If we look at the Black Sabbath discography, and this is only the early Sabbath stuff. I mean, they released a whole lot of albums after this, but I'm just going to stick especially with the 70s stuff because that's what we're talking about here. Again, we'll get in especially the origins of metal and stuff like that. But my point is this. For many people, the epitome of heavy metal, or the creators of it, is Black Sabbath. Yeah, they were important, but you know, they didn't play metal all the time, and I think that's what mixes people up. That's why they confuse hard rock with heavy metal, because the prototypical metal bands weren't metal all the time, right? If you think of if people are familiar with the albums, the first Black Sabbath album, there's lots on the first album that to me is blues. Almost all the side 2, the whole Warning part, that's mostly blues. I don't think that's heavy metal. There's some metal songs on the first album for sure. The song Black Sabbath, sure, right? There's like an NIB, sure. Right? But there's lots of stuff on here I wouldn't call metal. Sabbath at their heaviest, at least in the Ozzy era, would be Paranoid, Master of Reality, and Volume 4. But these albums aren't metal back to back. Off Paranoid, their biggest selling album of all time, a song called Planet Caravan. Trippy, Pink Floyd-ish, not heavy metal. Kind of heavy, but not metal, right? Song Fairies Wear Boots. That to me is as much hard rock as it is metal. Right? It's almost got a swing sort of jazz feel to it, right? Yeah, Iron Man and War Pigs, sure, they're metal, but there's lots of stuff on there I don't think is metal. It's hard rock at best, right? Master of Reality, overall a really heavy album, but the song Solitude, that's not metal, right? Great song, not metal. Volume 4, how about a song like Changes? That's a flat-out ballad. Ozzy's daughter saying that. Right? I mean, covered it. She didn't sing it on the album, but she covered it many, many years later, right? It's a flat-out ballad with a piano, right? Not heavy metal, right? And in fact, many of these albums have really, really gentle acoustic guitar pieces, you know, that are not even close to metal. They're great songs, but they're not metal, right? And then we get to some of their more progressive stuff. Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I would argue Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, maybe half that album is metal. There's a lot of songs on that album that to me aren't even close to metal. Who Are You? That synthesizer, trippy, hippie kind of stuff. Cool song, but not even close to metal. Song Fluff is 4 minutes of fluff. Acoustic guitars and mellotrons and all kinds of stuff. About as unmetal as you can get. Sabracadabra is a rock and roll song. Rick Wakeman plays almost honky-tonk piano on it, right? It's not metal. It's a great song, but it's not metal, right? Spiral Architect has a bit of an orchestra and it's kind of progressive, but again, I don't hear it as metal at all. You know, Sabotage, Am I Going Insane Radio? Again, another synth poppy tune. And by the time we get to albums like Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, the late 70s, the last few albums with Ozzy in the original run of Sabbath, right? And these albums are controversial. Like, some people don't even like these albums. I do. I think they're great. But we're struggling to say even half of these albums are metal, right? Technical Ecstasy, It's All Right, sung by Bill Ward. That could be a Beatles song. And no, I'm not kidding. Right? It's on a Black Sabbath song, it's about as heavy as the Beatles, right? And even lighter would be a song called She's Gone, one of the sappiest ballads I've ever heard. And this is coming from the monster Black Sabbath, right? Song called Rock and Roll Doctor. Great song, but it's, as the name implies, it's rock and roll. It's not metal, you know? The Never Say Die album, I mean, there's a song called Air Dance, which sounds like light and fluffy prog rock, something like Yes would do. You know, it's a good song, but again, nothing like metal. Over to You, a pop song, right? I mean, again, Junior's Eyes, same sort of deal. You know, Hard Road, rock. You know, even the title track Never Say Die, great song, but that's a rock and roll song, or maybe hard rock at best. There's very little metal on Never Say Die. Shockwaves, maybe. There's a couple that you could probably pick out, but generally speaking, so I think you get my point. And just quickly, another all-time metal band in the eyes of most people. And don't get me wrong, Judas Priest was pretty metal a lot of the time, you know, no question. I'm not saying they weren't. I'm not saying people are wrong if they call them a metal band, because yeah, they are. For lack of a better classification, Judas Priest is heavy metal. No argument. However, and this is what confuses people, there's a lot of stuff Judas Priest did that wasn't metal. And actually, as it turns out, some of the most popular songs or whatever are not heavy metal. Right? I mean, again, I won't go on and on about this, but early parts, I mean, there's early stuff, you know, there's quite a bit on rock and roll I would call progressive rock, actually. Not a lot of it's super heavy. Sad Wings of Destiny, their second album, widely considered one of their most important albums. And yeah, there are some incredibly important metal songs on here, but Dreamer, Deceiver, Epitaph, there's nothing metal there. These are actually pretty airy kind of ballad type songs. Same could be said for a couple songs off Sin After Sin. In fact, I would say Stained Class and Painkiller, so the 78 album and the 1990 album, would be the only albums in probably Priest's entire discography that's pretty much metal wall to wall, right? Every other album has its many non-metal moments. And, you know, a song like From British Steel, which has a whole lot of metal on it, but Living After Midnight, one of the most popular songs, that's not metal, folks. That's hard rock. That's party hard rock if I ever heard it. How about You Got Another Thing Coming? Probably Priest's most popular song. Same deal. I don't hear that as metal. That's hard. That's party hard rock in a lot of ways. And then let's go even further. The Point of Entry album of 1981, I hear almost no metal on that album. That's Judas Priest doing hard rock. You know, maybe Solar Angels, maybe Desert Plains, metal-ish. Everything else on that album to me is hard rock. And then, probably the greatest offender would be, well, offender is maybe not the right word, but Turbo. I hear zero metal on that album. That's hard rock at best, and not particularly good hard rock. It's not my favorite album by Priest, right? But that's Priest being, dare I say it, hair metal. The poppiest form of metal of them all. And it's not even really metal. I'll get into that another time. But hair metal, in spite of its tag, isn't metal at all. It's pop rock, basically. Well, that's Priest kind of doing pop rock. Ram It Down has lots of non-metal moments. They covered Johnny Be Good, for Pete's sake, on Ram It Down. Yes, the Chuck Berry song, right? Chuck Berry is not metal. And Judas Priest didn't change it that much. Yeah, the arrangement is a little different. But so anyway, you get my point, right? So some of the bands that we classify as unambiguously heavy metal, and again, I'm not saying that's wrong. Calling Black Sabbath and Judas Priest heavy metal, yeah, that's fine. It is accurate, but I'm just saying they do a lot of stuff beyond metal. Some of it's much more hard rock, and I think that mixes people up. Okay, couple other things. Again, speaking of Iron Maiden and Metallica, two other of the prototypical metal bands. Like Judas Priest, Iron Maiden is unfailingly pigeonholed as a metal band, but I hear much of their catalog, especially after Peace of Mind, which was their fourth album, everything since then, I would say fitting quite nicely within the prog rock domain. Right now, no doubt, Maiden always has at least a couple full-on metal songs on any of their albums. They do. But the majority of their musical output involves long, complex suites of prog theater that incorporates several different kind of moods. I'm going to say a lot more about Maiden in the prog rock section I'm going to do in part 6. Okay, and who could forget the backlash that Metallica received for Load and Reload, right? Big backlash. I've done previous series on this, so you can check that out if you want. For allegedly forsaking metal and going in a decidedly hard rock direction with simple rockin' songs and wearing highly unmetal attire, right? So again, Load and Reload, I actually think they're good albums, right? But there's very little metal on those albums, even though it's from Metallica. Like, what could be more metal than Metallica? Well, actually, there's lots of examples of Metallica's not particularly metal, and a lot of that's on Load and Reload. Right, that's hard rock, you know, to me. There's very little metal on those albums. Okay, so that brings up some of the confusion. Some of these metal bands don't play metal all the time, and I think that mixes people up. But the reverse is true, right? So just to wrap this part up, we're going to look at the reverse as well. Many bands, best classified as hard rock, most definitely have their metal moments, or at least will have significant portions of their fan base that are self-identifying metal folk. Right? For example, Aerosmith. And I love Aerosmith, you know. Now, again, don't misunderstand me here. Aerosmith is quite rightly called a hard rock band or maybe just a rock band. That's fair. That's what Aerosmith is. But Aerosmith most definitely has their metal moments. There is no question. I mean, there's probably a couple songs on the first couple Aerosmith albums that maybe not metal, but sure edge up close to it. I'm thinking about Mama Kin from the first album. I'm thinking about SOS Too Bad from Get Your Wings, maybe Spaced. Again, if they're not metal, they're right there. But I'll tell you what, they crash through the metal barrier by the time we get to Toys in the Attic and Rocks. Again, lots of Toys in the Attic I wouldn't call metal, right? But Round and Round, holy cow. If you've never heard that song off Toys in the Attic, it's slow, brooding, heavy. Black Sabbath could have recorded Round and Round. Right? The title track, Toys in the Attic, is ripping along with incredible speed. The drums, the guitar. Hey, Judas Priest would be proud of that song, right? Those are metal songs as far as I'm concerned. Rocks has at least 3, you know. Combination, another heavy, heavy, brooding tune that Budgie or Sabbath could have recorded, right? I'm thinking of Rats in the Cellar. Again, a fast, speedy, thrashy almost kind of song, right? That, again, heavy metal as far as I'm concerned. Nobody's Fault. Testament covered that song, a metal band. And you know what? They didn't change it that much. They didn't need to because it's already a metal song, right? The Draw the Line album. Yeah, most of Draw the Line's pretty much rock, very blues rock in some ways. But the song Draw the Line, hey, that could be that. If that's not metal, it's right up against, it's edging up against it. Probably the most popular song from Draw the Line, Kings and Queens. I'm sorry, that's heavy metal to me. Heavy, brooding, boom, boom, you know. Yeah, it's melodic, but it's heavy as anything, right? Night in the Ruts, you know, maybe no surprise. That to me is a metal song, right? So again, you kind of get my point. And real fast, how about a band that no one would ever say, well, you know, Queen, one of the most popular bands in the world, well, that's a metal band. No, they're not a metal band. I'm not going to say they're a metal band. But if you don't think Queen had metal moments, you're not listening closely enough, or you're just not familiar with the early stuff, the early discography. Queen 1, Sons and Daughters. If you've never heard Sons and Daughters, and remember, gotta remember the time frame, 73. Nobody was, when Queen wanted the rock heavy, Brian May, his guitar tone, I'm telling you, he rivaled Iommi, he rivaled, you know, Sabbath, Budgie. When he wanted to be heavy, he was heavy. Sons and Daughters, one of the heaviest songs from the 70s, flat out. Corrosion of Conformity covered this song recently. Again, they're a metal band and one of the heaviest metal bands around. Again, they played it straight up. They didn't have to make it heavier. It already was. Liar from the first album, too, to me, could be metal. Queen 2 is all over the place. Queen 2 is a beautiful album. Love this album. Right? It's so progressive. It's all has all kinds of feels, all kinds of styles as Queen at their best does. But when they wanted to be heavy, check out Ogre Battle. Ogre Battle is for 1974, one of the heaviest songs going. Period. Black Sabbath would have been proud to record that. Brian May's guitar tone on Ogre Battle is one of the angriest tones I've ever heard. Father to Son, very much a progressive song, I would say. But when it's heavy, it's crushingly heavy, you know? The Sheer Heart Attack album, Stone Cold Crazy, maybe the first thrash metal song ever written. I'm not kidding you. Metallica covered this. And again, they didn't change it. They didn't have to. It's like Metallica. It's like the song was written for Metallica, right? Brighton Rock from Sheer Heart Attack. Tons of over-the-top heavy guitar heroics on there, right? And even from Night at the Opera and Day at the Races, there are songs, again, very diverse albums. But when they wanted to rock hard, they were edging right up to metal there. News of the World, the song Sheer Heart Attack is a metal song for sure, right? And on it goes, right? So I think you get my point. Okay, so let's kind of bring this home. Right, so, okay. Okay, so one could easily identify well-defined metal nuggets within the otherwise rock catalogs of Van Halen, Queen, Alice Cooper, Kiss, etc., right? So we mentioned Queen, but, you know, Van Halen, right? Van Halen is not a metal band, but there's no question Eddie had lots of his metal moments. Why do you think so many heavy metal fans love Eddie? Not just because of his guitar work, which was, you know, otherworldly, but because at times Eddie was one heavy dude. Right? And again, so same with Kiss. At times, Kiss went over the edge towards metal, and on it goes. For decades, Lemmy from Motorhead, the Young Brothers, Angus and the late great Malcolm of AC/DC, and Ted Nugent declared themselves to be purveyors of rock and roll, right? And most definitely followers of Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and on it goes. No matter how many times an interviewer would erroneously tag them metal, right? And usually they got offended. Well, Ted certainly did and still does if he's called metal, right? Indeed, close examination of the Motorhead, AC/DC, and Nugent discographies reveal a clear lineage to the rhythm and blues and rock and roll legends of the 50s and 60s. There's no question, right? But again, here's where it gets confusing for people. Because AC/DC, Motorhead, and Nugent, I guess especially Motorhead, since these hard rockers played with such ferocity and over-the-top volume, it is easy to understand why there's always been confusion, right? Moreover, I think it is fair to say that many of those enjoying the work of Lemmy, Angus, and Ted are indeed also metal fans, right? Especially in the case of Motorhead. And since the musicians themselves often looked metal, misclassifications were inevitable. It's no wonder this gets confusing. Like, Lemmy looked metal. Like, I mean, the long hair, the black, everything, the way he talked, he looked as metal as anybody. But if you really listen to Motorhead, they're rock and roll. I mean, Lemmy, who always did this in a good-natured way when he was called heavy metal, he didn't get sort of as angry as Ted did, right? But so there was no confusion, or at least Lemmy trying to help the confusion. For the last 10 years of Motorhead's career, Lemmy, before they even played a note, would come up to the mic and go, "We are Motorhead. We play rock and roll," just to try to nail home the fact that, no, I'm not a metal band, I'm rock and roll. But, you know, I don't think it mattered. Most people thought he was metal. Anyway, therefore, some of the most renowned heavy metal bands are not metal all the time. And many hard rock artists routinely cross into metal territory as well, right? So it gets confusing. So I think, for clarity, it's better to think of the art form, heavy metal music that is, as being the invention, and be less concerned about trying to categorize those who play it, whether that be part of the time or all the time, especially in terms of their worth as inventors, right? So if we separate those two things, this becomes a lot clearer. It's heavy metal that's the invention, not necessarily the players, who don't necessarily stay in their own lanes all the time, right? Otherwise, this leads to a lot of inconsistencies and glaring omissions, as the next section will demonstrate. So in part 3, hopefully you'll check that out. And I'm going to get into the whole question of, should we even worry who invented heavy metal, the invention, right? And I'm going to get into that. And as to why I think it's way too narrow to say that Black Sabbath invented heavy metal. And I'll talk to you about why I think that's the case. So hopefully you'll check me out in part 3. Take care, everybody!